Inside the 22nd floor, the central heating hummed steadily, carrying the scent of expensive oak and floor wax. But to Gideon Vance, this luxurious atmosphere felt more suffocating than the thick dust of the rodeo arenas he once dominated. A rhythmic metallic clank echoed with every step Gideon took. It was the crude iron brace locked tight around his left shin, a relic of that hellish fall 5 years ago, when a horse named Devil's Eye decided to end a legend's career. Gideon wore a jacket coated in road grime, scuffed leather boots, and carried a faded cowboy hat in his hand. He didn't spare a glance at the fine art lining the hallway, focusing only on keeping his balance. Beside him, Noah, a 10-year-old with a mop of messy brown hair, gripped the hem of his father's coat. Noah didn't speak. His deep blue eyes darted constantly, as alert as a fawn among predators. Gideon's other hand led Daisy. The 6-year-old's cheeks were flushed red from the cold. An intermittent wheezing rasped from her small chest. Daisy clung to a raggedy cloth doll, her eyes wide as she stared at the magnificent chandeliers above. "Almost there, kids," Gideon whispered, his voice as gravelly as a dirt road. The heavy double oak doors swung open. Inside, Cassian and Vance Jr. were already nestled into plush leather chairs. Cassian, the eldest, wore a bespoke suit worth a small fortune and was sipping bourbon. Vance Jr. was preoccupied with his phone, glancing impatiently at his watch. When they saw Gideon enter, the dry clank of his leg brace echoing through the room, neither could hide their disgust. "You're 10 minutes late, Gideon," Cassian said without looking up. "And I told you not to bring the kids. This is a law office, not an orphanage or a charity ward." Gideon didn't answer. He quietly pulled 2 wooden chairs against the wall for Noah and Daisy, then stood tall beside them, leaning on a rugged maple cane. His silence was like a granite cliff, unmoving against the waves of contempt from his brothers. Attorney Miller, a man with a face as stone-cold as a statue, cleared his throat and opened the leather file on his desk. "Let us begin, according to the last will and testament of Mr. Vance Sr." As the will was read, it felt like a series of back-to-back slaps to Gideon's face. The entire massive cattle operation in the South, the lucrative shipyards in Seattle, and bank accounts worth millions were split evenly between Cassian and Vance Jr. The two began to smirk, exchanging satisfied nods. Finally, Miller paused, removed his reading glasses, and looked at Gideon with a mix of pity and confusion. "And finally, for the youngest son, Gideon Vance Sr. has left the full deed to Parcel 402, commonly known as Broken Spine, in the Harlan Mountains of Wyoming. This includes a cabin, all structures on the land, and an iron key held in the safety deposit box." A burst of laughter cut the lawyer off. Vance Jr. slammed his hand on the table, laughing until he teared up. "Broken Spine? That limestone graveyard? Pop really left you that heap of junk?" Cassian couldn't suppress a sneer either. "You know why they call it that, Gideon? Because any fool dumb enough to try and work that land will break his back before he harvests a single blade of grass. Dad won it in a $5 poker hand from a drunk 30 years ago. He never even bothered to set foot on it once." Gideon felt his heart tighten. He didn't need his father's money, but this public humiliation felt like a knife twisted in a wound that never healed. He looked at Daisy, who had just pulled out her inhaler to take a deep breath, her small face lined with exhaustion. He looked at Noah, who was staring intently at the rusty key the lawyer had pushed toward their father. "Gideon." Cassian stood up, buttoning his blazer as he walked toward his brother. He pulled a $20 bill from his breast pocket, snapped it between 2 fingers, and held it out. "I'll make you a deal. I'll buy that key off you for this 20. It's enough to buy your daughter a new inhaler and get that mute kid some fried chicken. Consider it an act of mercy, since you're so washed up." Vance Jr. chimed in with a laugh. "Yeah, take it. Even the vultures don't bother flying over Broken Spine." Gideon looked at the bill, then into Cassian's shiftless eyes. For a moment his breathing became terrifyingly steady. The instinct of a man who used to wrestle 1,000-pound bulls surged back to life. He didn't take the money. Instead, Gideon reached out not for the cash, but for Cassian's collar. Despite his crippled leg, the raw strength in a real cowboy's arms and chest was enough to send Cassian off balance, slamming him down onto the oak table. Gideon's wooden cane pressed hard against his older brother's throat, pinning him until his face turned purple. "Listen close," Gideon growled, his voice vibrating through the silent room. "I might be a cripple, but I've never begged for a handout in my life. Put your money away before I make you eat it." Noah bolted upright, his small hands clenched into fists, shielding Daisy behind him. The boy's eyes burned with the exact same fire as his father's. Gideon let go, sending Cassian sprawling back into his chair, gasping for air. He reached out and took the rusty key. It felt strangely heavy and cold. He shoved it into his jacket pocket and turned to his children. "We're leaving," Gideon said curtly. "You'll regret this, Gideon," Cassian yelled from behind, his voice trembling with humiliation. "There's a storm coming tonight. Let's see if your $5 castle keeps those kids alive through the night." Gideon didn't look back. The clank of his iron brace on the marble floor rang out with pride until the elevator doors slammed shut. Stepping out of the building, the biting Wyoming cold slapped them in the face. Gideon scooped Daisy up, shielding her inside his oversized coat. Noah ran close, clutching his father's belt. Their 2009 Ford truck sat lonely under a thick layer of snow in the parking lot. Gideon cranked the engine. It groaned heavily before finally turning over. The gas needle hovered just above empty. In his pocket sat exactly $20, not cash-ins, but the money he'd earned shoeing horses for a local ranch last week. "Daddy," Daisy whispered, her voice raspy from the thin air. "Is our new home far?" Gideon reached into the back seat, checking the tiny remaining backup oxygen tank. He patted his daughter's hand, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, where the snow had already blurred the lines. "Not far, Princess. We're going to a castle in the stars. Up there, nobody's ever gonna look down on us again." He shifted into gear, and the beaten-down truck slowly rolled out, leaving the bright lights of Casper behind, heading straight for the towering cliffs of the Harlan Mountains. Only one thought occupied Gideon's mind: he had to survive. Not for himself, but for Noah and Daisy. The 2009 Ford's headlights stabbed feebly through the whiteout, barely revealing the deep ruts in the trail leading to the cliff's edge. The truck groaned as it tackled the steep grade, its transmission emitting dry, metallic screeches. Gideon gripped the wheel, his knuckles white and eyes bloodshot from the strain. His left leg, cinched tight in that iron brace, began to cramp violently. The pain was like an electric drill boring into the marrow, but he couldn't ease off the gas. If the truck stalled now, the snow would bury them in less than an hour. Finally, a jagged silhouette emerged against the gray sky. Broken Spine wasn't just some fancy name. The cabin sat perched on a sheer ledge, looking like a giant's rotten tooth bared against the mountain winds. When the truck finally hauled itself to a stop, Gideon had to use both hands to lift his left leg off the pedal. He cracked the door, and the wind whipped into the cabin like a butcher's blade. Noah scrambled out, wrapping a threadbare wool scarf over his face, his eyes squinting against the raw power of Mother Nature. Gideon gathered Daisy into his arms. She'd gone limp, her breathing a ragged whistle that sounded as hollow as wind through a cracked door. He dragged his ruined leg through knee-deep drifts. The rusty iron key bit into the lock of the heavy timber door. It wouldn't budge. Gideon bared his teeth and threw his full weight into his left shoulder. Crack! The door flew open, taking a chunk of rotted hinge with it. It was colder inside than out. The air smelled of damp decades of dust and the rank musk of pack rats. Gideon set Daisy down on the only piece of furniture left, an old armchair, in the center of the living room, its upholstery shredded by rodents. "Noah, find anything that'll burn." "Now!" The boy nodded, flicking on a small handheld flashlight. While Noah scavenged rotted floorboards and vintage magazines from the turn of the century, Gideon knelt by Daisy. She was seizing slightly. The backup oxygen was bone dry. Daisy's lips were turning a frightening shade of purple. "Damn it, not now," Gideon growled. He dug through his memory of his years punching cattle on these high plains. His father, Walter Vance, might have been a grade-A bastard, but he was a master of folk medicine for both man and beast. Gideon remembered him using white sage and mountain licorice root mixed with honey to treat pneumonia in his prize stallions. He looked out the window. Through the blizzard, he saw the blurred shape of the old stables about 50 yards out. And that's where his old man kept the sick stock. Maybe, Just maybe, something was left. Noah, watch your sister, don't move a muscle. Gideon didn't bother with his cane. He crawled. He literally hauled himself on his hands and his good leg through the frozen hell outside. His dead leg dragged behind him like an anchor. Every yard gained felt like his lungs were being scorched by the cold. Reaching the stables, he shoved a collapsing door aside. Inside, the faint, lingering warmth of old manure still hung in the air. He fumbled along rotted wooden shelves until his hand struck a dust-covered tin box. Inside were pouches of dried herbs wrapped in wax paper, marked with his father's chicken-scratch handwriting. For the weak-winded. Gideon shoved the pouch into his shirt and crawled back to the house. By the time he made it, Noah had a small fire going in the stone hearth. Gideon immediately dumped snow into an old tin mug, heated it over the flames, and dropped a handful of the herbs in. A pungent, sharp, but warming aroma filled the room. He carefully lifted Daisy's head, trickling the herbal tea into her mouth, drop by drop. After a few minutes, the whistling in her chest eased. She opened her eyes, looking at her father with a weary but lucid gaze. "Daddy, you smell bad," Daisy whispered. Gideon let out a breath, a rare smile breaking across his scar-mapped face. "That's the smell of staying alive, honey." With the crisis averted, Gideon finally took in the house. The flickering firelight danced on pine walls, grayed by time. Noah was tracing his flashlight over the floor. The boy signaled with his hands, pointing to deep gouges in the hardwood scuffs that looked fresh, as if someone had dragged something heavy as hell across the room. Gideon took the light. He noticed something off. The cabin's skeleton wasn't normal. The corner posts weren't pine. They were steel I-beams racked in wood. The floorboards in the center of the room weren't rotted like the corners. They were polished and fit together with surgical precision. He stepped over and stomped his good boot down. Thud. Thud. It was a dense, solid sound, no hollow echo. There was something massive and reinforced underneath. While he was investigating the floor, Noah suddenly yanked on his jacket, pointing toward the window. The boy was shaking, his eyes wide with sheer terror. Through the frost-rimmed glass, Gideon saw two glowing red dots, like the eyes of a beast, staring at them from the abandoned mine entrance behind the house. Wolves? No. The gap between the eyes was too wide and too high off the ground. That was the infrared glow of night vision goggles. Gideon instantly blew out the lone candle and tackled Noah to the floor. "Get down, Daisy, stay still!" Shatter. A suppressed sniper round punched through the window, slamming into the armchair where Daisy had been sitting just minutes ago. Stuffing exploded into the dark. Gideon gritted his teeth. They were earlier than he'd figured. The people Cassian mentioned, or his hired muscle, were looking to finish the job on night one. He slid toward the corner where his old tin rodeo gearbox sat. Beneath the gold belt buckles and winner's ribbons lay a long retired Colt 45 and a box of greasy rounds. "Noah," Gideon whispered in the dark, taking his son's trembling hand. "I need you to be my eyes. Watch for movement at 2 o'clock. If you see that red light again, tap my hand." Noah nodded. The boy crawled toward a gap in the broken window shutter. Gideon leaned his back against the fireplace, the Colt cold and steady in his hand. His leg felt like it was being torn apart, but the brain of a cowboy who'd survived 100 wars on the backs of four-legged monsters was firing on all cylinders. He realized then that his father hadn't just left him a shack. He'd left him a stronghold. Those steel core pillars weren't for the roof, they were built to take a hit. And that heavy floor, it wasn't a floor, it was a lid. Tap. Tap. Noah hit the back of his hand twice. Gideon held his breath. He didn't look out the window. He looked into the old mirror hanging opposite. A dark shape was creeping onto the porch, a night vision rig casting a faint red glow on his head. Gideon didn't rush. He waited until the shadow reached for the doorknob, the knob he'd secretly wired to a cable from the truck battery he'd lugged inside earlier. Zap! A muffled cry of pain broke out, followed by the crackle of electricity. The intruder collapsed on the porch. Gideon didn't hesitate. He lunged from cover, ignoring the scream of pain from his leg, and opened fire on a second shadow emerging from the tree line. The shot didn't take the head, but a .45 slug was enough to blow the man back 6 feet. The roar of the gun echoed in the tight space, waking the monsters hiding in the night. Outside, the roar of an off-road engine kicked in. High-powered spotlights swept over the cabin. They weren't being quiet anymore. They realized this jimpy cowboy wasn't the pushover they expected. "Vance, hand over the key and I'll let the kids walk." A strange, gravelly voice boomed over a megaphone. Gideon pulled Daisy and Noah close, retreating into the kitchen area where the stone hearth offered the best cover. He looked down at a seam in the floor. The men end. A small inscription on a brass plate emerged from the dust. "Loyalty weighs more than gold." It clicked. The rusty key in his pocket wasn't for the front door. It was for the house itself. Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled the key out. As a hail of gunfire began to shred the outer wooden siding, he found a small keyhole hidden beneath the base of the stone fireplace. He jammed the key in and turned it hard. A deep mechanical thrum groaned from the earth. The entire center section of the floor began to shift, descending slowly like a hidden elevator, revealing a pitch-black bunker beneath. "Get in! Move!" Gideon shoved his children into the opening darkness. The heat from the ignited pine boards above seared the back of Gideon's neck like the breath of the devil. As the wooden floorboards slowly sealed shut, slicing the world of violence a bubble away from this void, an eerie silence swallowed the three of them. The gunfire and the muffled roars of the men outside became nothing more than faint vibrations thrumming through layers of thick earth and rock. Gideon's feet hit a flat, solid surface. He stumbled, his crippled left leg buckling, forcing him to lean hard on his cane to avoid toppling onto his kids. Noah made quick work of his flashlight. The white beam swept across the space, revealing a bunker built of heavy-duty, reinforced concrete. This wasn't some basic storm cellar. It looked more like a military observation post. "Daddy, it's cold," Daisy whispered, clinging to Gideon's leg, her wide eyes taking in the gray, lifeless walls. Gideon didn't answer. He moved toward a long wooden table in the center of the vault. On top sat a row of flickering vintage CRT monitors, a long-range radio, and geological maps encased in glass. But what caught his eye was an olive-drab steel trunk tucked under the table, the lid embossed with the Vance family crescent eagle, clutching a lasso. He knelt, brushing off a thick layer of dust with a calloused hand. Inside the trunk, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash like he'd expected. Instead, there were stacks of documents, circuit diagrams, and dozens of magnetic tape reels. In the corner sat a yellowed envelope addressed to him, for Gideon. Gideon opened the letter with shaking fingers. Walter Vance's handwriting was bold and hard-nosed, just like the man himself. "Gideon, if you're reading this, it means your two deadbeat brothers chose the money, and you chose the hard road. I know you still carry a grudge for that fall, but a cowboy only truly sees the sky when he's been bucked into the dirt. Broken Spine isn't just a pile of rocks. It sits on the only geothermal fault line in Wyoming. The maps at the bottom of this trunk are my life's work on a clean energy source that big corporations would level the state to get their hands on. I'm leaving it to you because you're the only one with enough grit to protect it and enough heart not to sell it out. Hold on to your kids. Don't let them turn into wolves like your brothers." Gideon gripped the letter tight. A bitter surge of emotion washed over him. The old man had calculated everything. He didn't leave money because he knew money would put a bullseye on Gideon's back immediately. He left a curse, but also a kingdom that only those willing to sacrifice could hold. "Noah, help me get that drawer open." Gideon pointed to a steel locker by the table. Inside was a heavy-duty medical kit, some tins of smoked ham, and most importantly, the small blue velvet box Daisy had mentioned. When he opened it, it wasn't jewelry. It was a device shaped like a pocket watch, but packed with intricate circuits and a digital screen showing seismic wave charts. "This is the real key," Gideon muttered. Just then a massive tremor shook the bunker ceiling. Dust rained down on their heads. They were using C4 to blast through the wooden lid above. Gideon knew that even with a steel core, that hatch wouldn't last long against demo experts. "We can't stay here," Gideon said, his voice regaining the steel of a leader. "Noah, get your pack on. Give your sister some chocolate for energy. We're taking the spider hole. With her," he pointed to a heavy steel door at the back of the bunker. According to the map, this path led deep into the mountain and out through a hidden cave behind the frozen waterfall on the eastern cliff. It was a hell of a trek, especially for a cripple and a kid with asthma, but staying put meant a death sentence. As they stepped into the pitch-black tunnel, Gideon heard the harsh scrape of metal right behind them. They were through. Flashlights swept into the vault. "They're down here. Move out," Cassian's voice boomed, raspy with greed and rage. Gideon gritted his teeth, ushering the kids faster. The tunnel was steep and slick with condensation. His left leg was in open revolt. The iron brace bit into his flesh until blood began to soak through his jeans. Every step was pure torture, but hearing Daisy's heavy breathing and feeling Noah's small hand guiding him, Gideon felt stronger than a mule. "Hold up," he whispered as he caught a shift in the air. Ahead was a narrow chasm, spanned only by a rickety old wooden bridge. Below, an underground river roared with a hollow thunder. This was the final gauntlet. Gideon sent Noah across first, then hoisted Daisy onto his shoulders. The bridge groaned under Gideon's weight and his metallic leg brace. As he reached the midpoint, a spotlight from behind pinned him in the back. "Don't move, Gideon." Cassian stood at the tunnel entrance, leveling a rifle. He no longer looked like a high-priced businessman. He looked like a man possessed by the devil of greed. "Give me that box, and I swear I'll let the three of you walk out of Wyoming for good." Gideon froze on the swaying bridge. He turned slowly, Daisy clutching his neck, Noah standing on the far bank, eyes wet but silent as the grave. "Don't you get it, Cassian?" Gideon gave a dry, stone-cold laugh. "Pop left this to me because he knew you'd sell your soul to those corporate suits. I might be dimpy, but I ain't blind. This fault line belongs to the land, not to snakes like you. I don't need a soul. I need leverage." Cassian screamed and squeezed the trigger. The bullet grazed Gideon's shoulder, knocking him off balance. He collapsed onto the rotted wooden slats. A terrifying snap echoed through the cavern. "Dad!" Noah screamed in his silence, lunging forward to save him, but Gideon threw up a hand. "Noah, look after your sister." Using the last of his strength, Gideon pulled a vintage trench grenade from his pocket, one he'd scavenged from the steel trunk. He looked at Cassian one last time, his eyes burning like an old wolf backed into a corner. "See you in hell, brother." Gideon pulled the pin and hurled the grenade at the bridge support on the far side, where Cassian stood. A deafening blast rocked the cave. Rocks rained from the ceiling, and a shroud of dust choked the air. The bridge snapped clean off. As he fell, Gideon saw the silhouette of his two children being thrown toward the safety of the cave exit. He felt the icy bite of the underground river swallow him whole. His mangled leg went numb. He closed his eyes, his mind filling with images of Daisy laughing and Noah riding horses across an endless green range. But the darkness didn't last. A small, thin hand, as certain as a vice grip, snagged his jacket collar. Noah, the boy, hadn't run. He had hitched a cowboy rope to a rock spur and dove down exactly the way his father had taught him during those hard Scrabble training days. Noah gritted his teeth, his face flushed purple with the effort, hauling his heavy father out of the white water and onto a narrow ledge below the bunker wall. Gideon coughed up a lungful of water, staring at his son in pure shock. The silent boy he'd always tried to shield was now the one pulling him back from the brink. "Noah," he wheezed. The boy didn't make a sound. He just wrapped his arms around his father and sobbed. Daisy's voice drifted down from the cave mouth, her cries mingling with the wind whistling through the jagged rocks. The biting chill from the underground river soaked through his coat, cutting to the bone, but the numbness was a mercy. It let Gideon temporarily forget the gut-wrenching pain in his left leg. He lay on the narrow ledge, his chest heaving like a busted bellows. Noah still gripped his hand. The boy's eyes blazed with an iron-willed resolve Gideon had never seen before. High above, through the settling rock dust, Daisy's cries drifted down from the cave mouth, shredded by the whistling wind. Gideon gritted his teeth and used his raw, bloodied hands to claw at the sheer rock face to sit up. The metal leg brace was twisted into a wreck, its jagged edges biting into his flesh, sending blood trailing down the gray stone. He pulled his cowboy dirk from his belt, flicked the blade, and decisively sliced through the leather straps. The brace fell away, hitting the dark water below with a hollow splash. "Noah, get me my stick," Gideon whispered. His voice cracked from the cold. Noah retrieved a maple cane. It had a long, stressed fracture, but was still stout enough. The boy helped his father up, his small shoulders becoming the anchor for the broken giant. They slowly clawed their way back up to the exit, where Daisy waited. As the gray light of dawn broke through the frozen waterfall at the cave mouth, Gideon saw Daisy huddled in a ball, her inhaler emitting a weak, desperate hiss. But the real horror wasn't the asthma. Three dark silhouettes stood blocking the entrance. Leading them was Cassian. He had lost his slick businessman look. His face was a map of scratches from the blast, his blazer torn to shreds, and he was leveling a rifle straight at Daisy. The two hired guns, professional hitmen geared to the teeth, held the little girl's tiny arms fast. "I told you, Gideon," Cassian spat a glob of blood, his eyes wild and cold-blooded. "You can't beat the wolves when you're just a lame horse." Gideon froze, his breath turning to ice in the air. Noah started to surge forward when Gideon clamped a hand on his shoulder. He knew any wrong move would cost Daisy her life. "Let her go, Cassian," Gideon said, his voice dropping into a low growl that carried the weight of a man who'd cheated death 1,000 times in the rodeo dirt. "You want the black box? The maps? They're right here, in my head and in this boy's hands. Don't you touch her." Vance Jr. stepped out from behind, holding a tracking device. "He's right, big brother. We need the biocodes and the decryption keys in that velvet box. If the girl dies, it'll take us years to crack the lock, and the corporate suits won't wait that long." Cassian licked his lips and signaled a shooter to drag Daisy toward the ledge. "Give me the box, Gideon, now, or I'll give your daughter a lesson in flying from a 1,000-foot drop." Daisy looked at her father, her eyes wet, but she didn't make a sound. She reached into her pocket, gripping the object her grandfather had slipped her in secret. It wasn't a toy. It was a pressure trigger device Walter Vance had designed specifically for his favorite grandchild. Gideon looked at his daughter, then at Noah. A silent communication passed between them. Noah suddenly stepped back, raising the velvet box high as if he were going to pitch it into the abyss. "Don't!" Cassian screamed, his muzzle wavering in a panic. That was all the daylight Gideon needed. Ignoring his shattered left leg, Gideon threw every ounce of weight onto his good foot, launching himself forward with unholy power. He didn't use a gun. He used the maple cane like a spear, driving it straight into the gut of the merc holding Daisy. Simultaneously, Daisy did exactly what her father had taught her for life or death moments. She slammed the red button on the device in her pocket. A high-pitched shriek ripped through the crevices of broken spine. It was a high-frequency acoustic wave designed to fry electronics and scramble the central nervous system. Cassian and his goons doubled over, clutching their heads as their night vision goggles and radios popped in a shower of blue sparks. "Noah! Daisy!" "But bolt for the pines!" Gideon roared. He didn't follow them. Gideon knew he was the lightning rod. He dragged his bloodied leg toward a charcoal gray Mustang, the only wild horse left on the ranch, standing spooked near the tree line. Gideon didn't need a saddle. He grabbed the mane and used his raw upper body strength to swing himself up. "Move it, old friend." Gideon dug his heels in. The chase tore across the sheer limestone ridges of the Harlan Mountains. Cassian, recovered from the sonic shock, piled into an armored jeep, wildly spraying lead at the silhouette of his brother galloping across the cliffs. Gunshots shattered the quiet of the Wyoming morning. Gideon rode like a demon from hell. He didn't stick to the trail. He baited Cassian into the Devil's Throat, a patch where thin limestone crusts hid massive geothermal sinkholes. This was his final play. If he couldn't keep his father's legacy, he'd bury it along with these greedy bastards. "You ain't getting away, Gideon." The jeep's engine roared right on his tail. Gideon glanced back, seeing Cassian baring his teeth, gripping the mounted machine gun. Gideon looked at the ground. He saw the faint wisps of steam rising through the cracks. The geothermal pressure was at a breaking point from the earlier vault explosion. He yanked the reins, urging the horse to leap over a deep fissure. Cassian's jeep, too heavy and moving too fast, couldn't stop. It plowed straight into the center of the thin shell. Crack, crack, crack. Boom! The earth disintegrated under the jeep's weight. But instead of falling into a dark hole, a pillar of scalding water and high-pressure steam erupted like a miniature volcano. The jeep was tossed into the air and slammed down into the wreckage. Gideon slid off the horse, his left leg collapsing onto the cold stone. He gasped for air watching the smoking ruins. Cassian crawled out from the scrap metal. His legs crushed by the engine blocked the exact same fate Gideon had suffered years ago. Gideon walked over, a hitch in his stride, but steady. He didn't draw his gun. He just looked down at his brother with a mix of disgust and pity. Pop didn't leave this to you because he hated you, Cassian. Gideon's voice echoed off the canyon walls. He did it because he knew you couldn't carry the weight. You wanted the gold, but you ended up digging your own grave. Cassian looked at his brother, his face twisted in pain and hate. But when he saw Noah and Daisy emerge from the pines safe and sound, his eyes finally went hollow. He realized he hadn't lost a strength he lost because he had nothing to protect but a pile of greenbacks. Gideon turned his back, scooped Daisy up, and let Noah lead the gray Mustang. He didn't need to finish Cassian. The Wyoming wilderness and his own choices would do that for him. "Daddy," Daisy whispered, stroking the cut on her father's face. "Let's go home to our castle." The jeep's engine died out, replaced by the dying hiss of geothermal steam and the sharp pop of heated limestone cooling and cracking. Gideon stood still in the shimmering white mist, feeling the artificial warmth from the earth fade into the sub-zero Wyoming chill. His left leg was past the point of pain. It was stone cold, a block of flesh and bone pushed far beyond its limits, but his mind had never been sharper. He turned his head at the sound of small footsteps crunching through the fresh powder. Noah was approaching, leading the charcoal gray Mustang that breathed white plumes of frost from its nostrils. Behind him, Daisy walked slowly, her eyes still haunted by the night, but her lips had lost their purple tint. She broke into a run, burying her face in her father's waist. Gideon rested a calloused hand on her head, feeling her heartbeat steady against his palm. "Noah, get your sister back to the stables," Gideon ordered, his voice low but filled with an ocean of relief. "Don't look back." The boy nodded, taking his sister's hand and leading the horse out of sight behind the pines. Gideon lingered for one last minute. He looked toward the wreckage of the armored jeep. Cassian lay there, legs pinned under the heavy steel, eyes staring blankly at the sky as it shifted from a dull gray to a crystal-clear morning blue. Vance Jr. was long gone. He'd likely hightailed it the second the geyser erupted, true to the nature of a man who always looked for the easy out. Gideon leapt toward the cabin. The house still stood on the ledge of broken spine. Even with the porch scorched and the timber blackened by gunfire, its steel skeleton held firm, not budging a single millimeter. He pushed open the heavy door, stepping into a room now flooded with the golden light of sunrise. The first thing Gideon did wasn't checking the treasure or calling a lawyer. He knelt on the floor, unfurled the geological map, and looked at his father's final handwritten note on the back. There was a set of coordinates and a single question: will you use it to build or to burn? Gideon closed his eyes. He already had the answer. 3 weeks later, Broken Spine was no longer a name for a joke. With the help of Attorney Hawkins, who had uncovered the full murder-for-hire plot and the move to jump Gideon's inheritance, Gideon officially took over his father's legacy. He didn't sell the land to the energy giants. Instead, he established a conservation trust and partnered with the state to turn the geothermal fault into a clean energy project for the entire Harlan region. Under one condition: the Vance Ranch had to become a horse sanctuary and a rehab center for kids with disabilities. The cabin was fully overhauled. New pine boards, smelling of fresh resin, were bolted onto the old steel frame. Behind the house, the old mine was sealed tight, leaving only a small entrance to the vault now repurposed as a library for the High Plains history. On an April afternoon, with the snow finally melted and green shoots poking through the once barren ground, Gideon sat on his new porch. He wasn't wearing that old iron brace anymore. A modern carbon fiber prosthetic, a gift from the project's medical team, let him stand tall without a cane. Daisy's laughter rang out from the lavender garden. She was racing a young foal, no inhaler in sight, her lungs strengthened by the crisp mountain air. Not far away, Noah was using sign language to show a group of new kids how to tie a hondo knot. Gideon reached into his jacket and pulled out the rusty key from a year ago. He looked at it, then at the gold rodeo buckle mounted on the living room wall, a relic of a hell-raising past. He realized then that his father's $5 bet wasn't a prank. It was the ultimate character check. Walter Vance knew that only a man who had been broken from the inside out would be tough enough to mend the broken things around him. "Daddy, look!" Daisy ran up, holding a sprig of purple wildflower. Gideon scooped her up, letting her sit in his lap. Noah walked over, standing by his father's side. The boy looked at Gideon, his lips moving with a painful effort. Dad, Dad." The sound was gravelly and tiny, but to Gideon it was louder than any gunshot or blizzard blast. He froze, then pulled both his children into a crushing hug. Hot tears tracked down the weathered face of the old cowboy.